The next time you fly, look down at the floor between your feet. There are vents cut into it, small ones near the walls, and you have probably never noticed them. Those vents exist because of one aircraft, one door, and 77 seconds in 1974. Everybody who could have prevented it knew about the problem beforehand. This is the forest of 37 kilometers northeast of Paris. On the 3rd of March 1974, a 9-month-old wide body came down here in a straight line half a kilometer long. 346 people. At that moment, the deadliest crash in the history of aviation. Both engines were running normally. The crew were experienced and healthy. The weather was clear. Nothing was wrong with the aircraft that morning, in the sense you would normally mean it. And from the first sign of trouble to the ground, they had 77 seconds. So what can take a healthy aircraft out of the sky that fast and leave 2 professional pilots with nothing at all to fight with? Hold that question, because the newspapers had an answer within days, and you have probably heard it. A baggage handler had failed to close a door properly. Careless work, terrible luck, tragic result. I am going to show you that this answer is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong in the specific way that lets the same thing happen to somebody else. Because 21 months earlier, an engineer sat in an office in San and wrote down exactly what was going to happen. The wrong door, the collapsing floor, the severed controls, an aircraft that nobody on board could save. He put it in a memo. His own management agreed with him, and then the memo stayed inside the building. By the end of this, you will know what actually opened that door, why the fix that existed was optional, and the one conversation between 2 men that turned a known defect into 346 deaths. If that sounds like a story about one bad airplane in the 70s, stay with me. The reason those vents are under your feet today is that the industry decided this must never be possible again. To understand what failed, you first have to understand what this aircraft was built for. And it was not built calmly. 55 meters long, 3 engines, around 350 seats. In 1970, an aircraft this size was the most valuable product in the world. 2 American companies were building almost the same airplane at the same time for the same airlines. Called theirs the DC-10, called theirs the L-1011. Now think about what that does to a design program. Every month you are late, a customer signs with the other side instead. Nobody in that building is being paid to slow down. Got their aircraft into the air first and into airline service first. That head start is the whole reason the DC-10 existed as a business. You are looking at a machine whose schedule was its main selling point. They also did something that matters more than it sounds. They subcontracted the entire fuselage to another company in San. So the people who designed the doors did not work for the company whose name was on the tail. Remember that. It becomes the hinge of the entire story. Have you ever worked on something where you could see a problem clearly, but the decision belonged to somebody in a different building? That is the exact situation we are walking into. Now the door. Give me 2 minutes on this, because once you understand the door, everything else in this video explains itself. Almost every door on an airliner opens inward. That is not a convenience choice. It is physics, and it is deliberate. At altitude, the cabin is pressurized because the outside air is too thin to breathe. The air around you pushes outward on every square centimeter of the hull. How hard? Harder than you think. On a door the size of a cargo hatch, that force adds up to several tons. Sitting there all the time, trying to push the door out into the sky. So here is the elegant part. If the door opens inward, that force cannot open it. The pressure is what holds it shut. It is called a plug door, and a plug door does not fail. It cannot. The cargo doors on this aircraft did not open inward. They opened outward, and they were held closed by steel hooks. Why would anyone choose that? Because an inward opening door has to swing into the hold, and that swing costs you cargo space. Cargo space is freight. Freight is revenue on every single flight for 30 years. So this is not somebody being stupid. It is a real engineering trade, and made the same trade on the L-1011. The difference is in how each company backed it up. Four steps. Hooks rotate over spools. The latches travel past center, so pressure cannot push them back. Locking pins slide in behind the latches. And if any of that is not right, the outside handle physically will not close. That last step is the safety, and I want you to notice what kind of safety it is. It is not a warning light. It is not a checklist. It is the handle itself refusing to move. That was the theory. In practice, the pins were driven by a small electric actuator through a mechanical linkage. If that linkage was slightly stiff or slightly out of adjustment, the pins would stop short of home. And here is the flaw at the center of everything. When the pins stopped short, the handle could still be forced down. It took real effort, but the linkage would bend and the handle would move. Which means the aircraft could taxi out with a cargo door that looked locked, felt locked, was signed off as locked, and was not locked. Used hydraulics on their door instead. If the pressure was not there, the mechanism simply would not complete, and nothing a human being did with a handle could fake it. So ask yourself something. If two teams solve the same problem and one solution can be defeated by a tired man pushing harder, is that a maintenance issue, or is that a design issue? If a defect like that exists in a fleet, you would expect an accident to find it. One did, 21 months early, and it gave the industry everything it needed. 12th of June, 1972, American Airlines Flight 96 out of Detroit, climbing through about 11,000 feet over Windsor, Ontario. Watch how closely this matches what you will see over Paris. The rear cargo door tears off the aircraft. The hold empties of air in a fraction of a second, and the pressure in the cabin above suddenly has nowhere to go but down. Down through the floor you are sitting on. The cabin floor collapses into the empty hold. And you need to know exactly what runs under that floor, because this is the part that kills people. On this aircraft, the control cables to the tail run under the cabin floor. The elevator, the rudder, the engine controls for the tail engine. All of them in that space under the passengers. Captain loses most of his control authority in about a second. He has a full aircraft, a hole in the fuselage, and controls that barely answer. He lands it anyway back at Detroit, flying it largely on engine thrust. 67 people walk away, and here is the detail that should stop you cold. Months earlier, out of pure curiosity, he had taught himself in a simulator how to fly the DC-10 on engines alone. Nobody asked him to. It was not in any syllabus. So the survival of 67 people came down to one man's private hobby. Does that sound like a safety system to you? It is not one. It is luck wearing a uniform, but look at what the industry now has. A complete demonstration of the failure. The aircraft intact on a runway. The door recovered from a field. And nobody killed. Investigators take the door apart, and they find the same signature every time. The latches were not over center. The pins had not traveled home. The handle had gone down anyway, and the linkage was bent where it had been forced. The National Transportation Safety Board writes it up and sends recommendations to the regulator. Their language is not vague. Make the door impossible to close incorrectly, and vent the cabin floor so a decompression below cannot destroy the controls above. You now know everything the industry knew in the summer of 1972. Nothing after this point is a surprise to anyone involved. And this is where it goes wrong. Not in a hangar, in an argument about what the word cause means. Because there was an explanation sitting right there, and it was comfortable, and every part of it was technically true. The door had been forced. A person had forced it. So the answer became human error. Train the handlers better, Add a placard next to the door. Make the procedure clearer in the manual. Does any of that sound familiar from your own workplace? I want to be fair to that answer, because it is not a lie and it is not stupid. If you write it in a report, every sentence in it survives checking. But ask what it leaves out. If a door can be forced shut by a tired man at the end of a shift, in the rain at 4 in the morning, whose fault is that really? A door that can be closed wrong will eventually be closed wrong. That is not a prediction about people being careless. It is arithmetic about how many thousands of times a door gets closed. And the regulator's own investigators had already said so in writing. The recommendation on the table was not better training. It was change the machine. There is an exact tool for that, and you should know its name, because the whole story turns on it. It is called an airworthiness directive. It is law. It names the aircraft, it names the fix, it sets a deadline, and if you have not done it, you do not fly. Not a suggestion, not a target. For this door after Windsor, no directive was issued. So what happened instead? This is the moment the video exists for. Everything before it was set up. Everything after it was consequence. The head of the aviation regulator and the head of the aircraft manufacturer spoke to each other directly, senior man to senior man. They agreed that the manufacturer would correct the doors voluntarily through service bulletins to the airlines, and that no mandatory directive would be issued. Nothing about that is illegal. That is what makes it worth your attention. Two men settled it between themselves. It has been known ever since as the gentleman's agreement, and it is taught in universities as a case study in how not to regulate. Do you see what that swap actually changes? It is not the engineering. The fix on the paper is the same fix either way. What changes is who checks. A directive is by a regulator with the power to ground your fleet. A bulletin is by the company that would have to pay for the work. And there is a reason nobody at the top wanted a directive in 1972. A mandatory order against a brand new wide body is a public statement that the aircraft is unsafe. Orders were still being fought for against. Airlines read the trade press. You can see exactly how a reasonable person talks themselves into the quiet option. So the fixes went out as recommendations. Support plates for the linkage. A small viewing port so a handler could look in and physically see whether the pins had traveled. Hold that in your mind. A metal plate, roughly the size of your hand, that stops the linkage bending when somebody forces the handle. That is the entire fix. And on one particular aircraft, in one particular maintenance record, that plate was signed off as fitted. Now the document I promised you at the start. This one is genuinely uncomfortable to read. 2 weeks after Windsor, the director of product engineering had sat down to write to his own management. His name was Dan. Remember who he is. He is not a journalist and he is not an activist. He runs engineering for the company that actually designed the fuselage and the doors. His memo runs to about a page and a half. It is one of the most quoted documents in the history of engineering, and you are about to hear why. He states plainly that the door design is fundamentally unsound, that the fixes on the table are patches laid over a bad concept rather than a correction of it. And then he predicts the accident. In plain language, he says the fuselage will fail again, the cabin floor will collapse, and an aircraft will be lost with everyone on board. He was not leaking this. He was doing exactly what you would want an engineer to do. He wrote it down, he sent it up his own chain, and he recommended action. His management replied, and their reply is the sentence I would put on the wall of every engineering school. They agreed that he was probably correct on the technical points, and they explained that raising it formally with would expose to the cost of the redesign. So the memo went nowhere. It surfaced 2 years later in the litigation that followed the crash, when lawyers had the power to demand documents that engineers did not. Read that sequence again, because it is the real story here. The person who understood the risk best had the least power. The people with the power had a direct financial reason not to hear him. Nobody in that chain was a villain. Every individual decision was defensible on its own. Does that make you feel better about it or worse? I know which one I am. Now we can go to Paris, and I promise that everything that happens will make sense to you before it happens. Turkish Airlines Flight 981. Istanbul to Paris, then Paris to London. A routine two-leg service, the kind you have taken yourself, on an aircraft less than a year old. But that week, there was industrial action in Britain, and flights to London were cancelled. Passengers stranded were transferred onto whatever still had seats. The aircraft filled 346 people from more than a dozen countries, and a very large number of them were holding a ticket for a completely different aeroplane the day before. I mention that because it is the part people find hardest afterwards. Almost nobody on board had planned to be on that flight. In the hold, the rear cargo door was closed by a ground handler. He rotated the latches, then he pushed the handle down. The handle went down. Beside the door was the placard explaining the correct procedure, in English and in Turkish. He spoke neither language, and he had not been trained on this door type. Now he has carried the blame for 50 years, so let me be exact about what he did. He performed the operation the aircraft allowed him to perform, and he got the confirmation the design offered him. The handle went down. On any other door on that aircraft, that is proof. Would you have questioned it? Because the design told you not to. And the support plate that would have stopped the linkage bending was not behind that handle. The maintenance record said it was. It was not. The aircraft took off, turned north and climbed away over the suburbs. 9 minutes later, it was passing about 11,500 feet, still climbing over the forest. In the cockpit, everything is normal. Nothing has warned them. There is no light, no horn, no gauge anywhere on that flight deck that is looking at those locking pins. What happens next takes less time than it will take me to describe it to you. The rear cargo door separates from the aircraft. The hold empties in an instant, and the recorder catches the sound of it. You already know what comes next, and the crew do not. The cabin floor above the hold collapses downward. 2 rows of seats, and the 6 people in them, go out through the side of the aircraft with the floor section. Those seats will be found 16 kilometers from where the aircraft comes down. That distance is going to matter enormously in about 4 days. And the control cables running under that floor are cut. The crew still have engines. They no longer have an aircraft that answers what they ask it. On the recorder you can hear the decompression, then the crew working the problem. Not panicking, working it calmly, with almost nothing left to work with. The nose drops. The aircraft is now descending fast, in a shallow dive, with 2 men doing everything a human being can do with thrust alone. What would you want them to try? There was nothing left. 77 seconds after the door leaves, the aircraft strikes the forest at close to 800 kilometers an hour, almost level at high speed. There was no fire. The impact was so violent that a fire never had time to start. That single fact tells you more about the speed than any number I can give you. French police reached a scene that investigators afterwards described as the worst recovery any of them had ever worked. I am not going to describe it, and you do not need me to. 346 people. 6 of them were already 16 kilometers away, in a field, still in their seats. So how do you solve a crash where the aircraft is in pieces the size of your hand? You start with what is missing. The rear cargo door was not at the crash site. It was found 16 kilometers back along the flight path, in farmland, together with the seats and the section of cabin floor. Think about what that proves on its own, before anyone even picks it up. The door left the aircraft while the aircraft was still flying. It was not torn off by the impact. Within days, investigators knew what kind of accident this was. And because of Windsor, they knew exactly which parts of that door to look at first. Can you imagine opening a case and finding your own report already written? The latches had not gone past center. The pins had stopped short. The handle had been forced. And the support plate from the service bulletin was simply not there. That last line is the one that ends the argument. The aircraft's records said the modification had been carried out. The metal said it never had. Stamped complete. Never fitted. And now go back to Chapter 5 and ask yourself which of the two options would have caught that. A voluntary bulletin is checked by paperwork. A mandatory directive is checked by an inspector who has to see the part. That is the whole difference, and 346 people are standing in it. The manufacturer settled with the families rather than take it to trial. It was the largest settlement in aviation up to that point, and the memorandum was read out in the proceedings. Which is how you and I know about it at all. If those lawsuits had not happened, that memo would still be in a filing cabinet in sand. So what actually changed? More than you would expect, later than it should have. And you are sitting on top of one of the changes every time you fly. Vents were cut through the cabin floor, so that if the hold below ever loses pressure, the air above can follow it instead of tearing the deck apart. The latch mechanism was redesigned so that a partially locked door physically blocks the handle, the way it was supposed to in the first place. And the viewing port became mandatory, not optional. Every one of those changes was already written down in 1972. Those floor vents are on the aircraft you flew in last year. You have sat directly above them on every flight of your life without ever knowing what bought them. The regulator changed too, and not gently. The idea that a manufacturer could volunteer its way out of a mandatory order became almost impossible to defend in public afterwards. And engineering schools started teaching the memorandum, not as a technical document, as the standard example of what happens when the person who sees the problem cannot make anybody act on it. The aircraft itself went on to fly for decades and became genuinely safe. But the name never fully recovered, and in the industry that is remembered as an expensive lesson in its own right. Before the end, the part most videos skip, and the part you should probably want from anyone telling you a story like this. I cannot tell you that a mandatory directive would definitely have saved this flight. Directives are enforced by inspections, and inspections are also done by people who get tired. I cannot tell you the exact words that passed between those two men. What survives is the outcome and the recollections of people around it, not a transcript. And I cannot tell you what the handler had understood as he pushed that handle. He has never been named in a way that lets anyone ask him properly, and I think that is right. But the pattern is not in dispute anywhere. A known defect, a documented warning, a voluntary fix, a stamped record for work never done, and an aircraft that fell out of the sky. Every link in that chain was visible in writing before it happened. That is what separates this from an accident, and it is why it still gets taught. So come back to the man the one who has carried this since 1974. He pushed a handle that the aircraft permitted him to push. Above him sat a memo predicting the outcome, a regulator that chose not to order the fix, and a maintenance stamp for work that was never carried out. He was the last man in a line that started years before he arrived at work that morning. He was just the only one standing there when it finished. There is a stone in the forest It is quiet there now. Most of the people who drive past it have no idea what it is for. Would you have stopped before this video? And if you have ever been told at work that a problem is real, but that raising it formally is somebody else's job, I would genuinely like to know what happened next. Tell me in the comments, because I think that answer is the whole point of this story. Thank you for staying to the end. Next time you board, look down at the floor. Now you know what those vents cost.